Hey guys, Caleb here with DSLR Video Shooter, and we're finally getting to the review for the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K. If you would like to really dive in on this camera because it's incredible and get the most out of it for video and filmmaking, I have completed a fully fledged guide, several hours long, diving into this camera and squeezing every last ounce of quality out of it. So if you really want to push this thing to the limits, definitely check out the guide. I'll have a link in the description, and you could also check out the trailer that I recently did for it. So what's the deal with the Blackmagic? This camera, in my opinion, is kind of like a poor man's red. It has some incredible potential for filmmaking. So this is not a toy. This is not a cheap garbage little camera. This thing has some wicked chops. It's also pretty much the cheapest Netflix camera out there. So it's not officially on Netflix's supported or approved cameras, but it has the specs to be there. Also, before we jump into my findings with this camera, I do want to say that you really shouldn't compare this to other cameras because it's completely different. It's very much like a Red. I wasn't joking when I said poor man's Red, because you need a bunch of stuff to make this whole system work. So it's not like a GH5 or a XT3, a mirrorless camera where you just put a battery in it, put a lens on it, and you can go shoot. You really do need to add some stuff to it, and we'll talk about why in a little bit. But if I were you, I would expect to pay between $2,000 and $2,500 to get a fully rigged setup that is usable for filmmaking and making videos. So without further ado, let's jump into what I think about this camera, starting with image quality. I think for under $2,000, there's no way you're going to beat this camera. It shoots RAW. It has an amazing amount of dynamic range. Of course, we have a micro four thirds sensor, so you're dealing with something smaller. But the good news about having bad autofocus, which this camera definitely has bad autofocus, is you can use speed boosters with pretty much no consequences. So currently my setup here is the most reduced focal reducer or speed booster that Metabones sells, the 0.64 adapter, link in the description. And I have a 24mm cinema lens on here from Rokinon. That's going to be a pretty great setup and get us larger than Super 35. So out of the gate, we can kind of solve that with speed boosters. If you want to save a buck or two, check out the Viltrox Speedbooster for, I believe, under $200. Also, because this camera has a micro four thirds sensor, you pretty much have the most flexibility when it comes to lenses. You can put a tiny 7-14 on here or build it up to full frame glass. Really, the sky's the limit with micro four thirds. Out of the box, we can record both RAW and ProRes on this camera, and there are multiple flavors of each. In the guide, I break down every single one and some recommendations, but if you already have this camera, I would recommend trying the 4:1 compression. It's the most compressed RAW option on the camera, but I found it's really, really good. And get this, it's only barely a hair larger when it comes to file size when you compare it to ProRes HQ. So if you've been thinking, RAW is too much, I'm just gonna do ProRes HQ, for a couple gigs more, you can switch over to RAW, which is pretty impressive. When it comes to dynamic range, things are looking really good on this camera, and it's pretty impressive how far you can push your files. I would say it's very similar to the GH cameras in that even in ProRes, you've got a lot of flexibility. When it comes to shooting RAW, I found you can overexpose about 3 stops and still recover your highlights, which is wild and awesome to have on such a cheap camera. I really like the film log mode on this camera. It gives you a lot of flexibility. The LUT profiles and everything in DaVinci Resolve are really, really powerful. And we should keep in mind that before too long, hopefully, we'll see Blackmagic Raw come to this camera. So right as I'm uploading this video, Blackmagic goes ahead and releases Blackmagic Raw to the Pocket 4K. So I actually just updated the camera while this video was processing here on YouTube. So as of this moment, you can download and install the update, which will give you Blackmagic Raw. So when you go into the menu, you'll see we now have several more options under Raw, and they also updated a lot of other things to this camera. So here we are, we have Blackmagic Raw, including the brand new 12:1, which I'm really, really excited about, being able to shoot small RAW files. It's gonna be pretty awesome. So I'm gonna update in the next couple days or weeks my guide to include all this new information. Just wanted to give you a heads up. It's hilarious how these things happen. At any rate, back to the video. And all those file sizes issues we were talking about are just going to get better and better, or less rough on our hard drives. So Blackmagic Raw has some wild compression options, letting us shoot RAW with very small file sizes. So I can't wait for that to come out, hopefully before too long. So RAW and ProRes, both great, and then we're able to record really awesome frame rates on this camera, up to 4K 60. It also has 120 frames per second in HD, and you can also shoot 120 frames per second RAW. So if you've been shooting on cameras like the one I'm using right now, the A6400, the A7 III, other cameras from, Fuji and Panasonic, we have those high frame rates, but that 1080p file we get out of them is often pretty rough. This camera, however, can shoot some really good slow motion. Now, of course, we have no in-body stabilization on this camera, which is really rough when you add in the fact that it's kind of an awkward camera to hold and it's very light. So adding a rig like you see here is really going to help with that, and pretty necessary. Another interesting thing with this camera is going to be the media options. We have 3 of them. I go through in my guide every single option and recommendations for what you should go with. But in short, you're going to spend some money if you want that higher lossless RAW options on this camera with various frame rates and resolutions. But you have those options, which I really appreciate Blackmagic including. Also having that USB-C option and using cheap drives like this Samsung T5 is really, really appreciated. When it comes to low light, I found some really interesting things with this camera. I would say it's similar to the GH5S with a couple of differences. It's not a low light monster. It does have the dual ISO, giving you, better dynamic range at higher ISOs. But this camera has one thing about low light that I have not seen under $5,000 on a camera, and that is the lack of color issues at higher ISOs. Traditionally, when you raise your ISO, you not only get more noise and color in that noise, but you'll see colors start to shift. So this red shirt I'm wearing would either become very desaturated or it would shift and become either magenta or more orange than red. So this is a huge problem with raising your ISO. This camera, on the other hand, keeps color information almost perfectly pristine until you hit the very last ISO level on the camera. So if you look at 400 native ISO, kind of the best shooting option on this camera, all the way up to really, really high ISOs, you'll notice color isn't really shifting. And that's something that's new to me, especially at this price point. All my other cameras fall apart after at max maybe 10,000 ISO. So color in low light and high ISOs on this camera is insanely good. Now let's jump over to audio land. This camera is really, really well equipped when it comes to audio. You have multiple inputs, including phantom power over XLR. And then when you jump into the menu system and start going through the audio configurations, you have a lot of options. You can also split channels, which I really, really love. Monitoring features on this camera are out of this world impressive. I hope most other companies kind of copy what Blackmagic is doing here. And it's important that monitoring is good because we have no flip out screen. Now I know people who are legit cinematographers are going to say, who cares? But a camera screen that's bolted on like this one is really tricky to work with. So using some kind of HDMI monitor is pretty much a must. So the way this works on this camera is you can control what shows up on the back of the screen and what shows up on the HDMI monitor to almost an infinite amount. You can have a clean image on either, you can have information on either, you can even do things like when I press this button, I want these 3 assist features to show up on the monitor and not show up on the camera. Lots of options. There's only one thing I wish they would have included, and that would be a joystick on the camera so I can see my menu on the HDMI. As it stands, you have got to keep the back of the camera open like you see here so you can see your settings and make changes. I'd love to be able to take a fat V mount and back it right up to the camera and use the HDMI monitor for all of my menu work, but unfortunately that's just not the case. Speaking of the lack of a joystick, this camera, when it comes to the button layout and the quality of the buttons, leaves a little bit to be desired. All the buttons are mushy. It's not a fun experience to use. Luckily the touchscreen is incredible on this camera, but I just wish they were either better quality buttons or just more of them. I would have appreciated more dials. So it's a little lackluster there, but again, we're looking at a $1,300 camera, so that really doesn't bother me. In addition to the buttons, the body kind of feels cheap, and it's insanely lightweight, which is great for using it on like a gimbal, but for handheld, it's gonna be rough. And if you're going for a very cinematic look and you want true handheld and not just floaty gimbal shots, you'll wanna build it up like you see here. Putting a cage on it, adding some weight helps a ton, but I kind of wish the body was a little heavier so you could reduce that weight and all that bulk and size and have something a little more beefy but small. When it comes to rigging, it's also a little awkward because of the width of this camera. It's a very wide camera, and part of that is the screen, and of course we've got the battery in the grip off to one side. And when it comes to power, folks, things are rough. We all knew this. You've heard this already, I'm sure. But there are several methods of powering the camera. So right now I'm using an MPF plate externally. You could also use a V-mount. The thing about it though is it's very awkward to power up externally because of this screen that we can't block. So you can't have a V-mount right over it, or else you won't be able to change your settings or do anything in the menus. So that's kind of a bummer, but you can work around it. It's just kind of janky. So in conclusion, I think this is a wonderful, wonderful camera to get started with, especially if you really want to get into cinematography and making movies. It's such a powerful camera for $1,300. Just keep in mind that you will need to invest a little bit in getting something rigged up like you see here. And by the way, if you want to see a whole video on this custom setup using a single battery to power everything, let me know. Maybe we'll do a video. That would be kind of fun. But it's a great filmmaker's tool. It's not like any other mirrorless camera, so I wouldn't compare it with cameras like this, the A6400 or even the X-T3. Those are very run and gun friendly. This one is gonna need some love to get set up, but it's going to get you much closer to kind of a Hollywood cinematic package, or as close as you can get to a red camera for under $2,000. It's got a crazy flexible mount and sensor for using pretty much any lens on the planet. It does good enough at low light. It shoots raw at 4K, has awesome high frame rate capabilities, and really good dynamic range. I also should mention that it comes with DaVinci Resolve, the full pro copy, if you will. So having that tool set, you're ready to edit, you're ready to do some wild grades, and that software alone is almost like going to post-production school once you start digging into it. So I love this camera. Unfortunately, I probably won't be using it as much as some of my mirrorless options, just because doing YouTube videos on your own and using something like this doesn't necessarily make sense. But if you're shooting commercials, documentaries, and even YouTube, and if you have some help, I think this is a wonderful camera, and you're just not going to beat the quality for what you're paying for here. So those are my thoughts on the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K. Check it out in the link in the description. Let me know if you want to see what's up with this whole rig and some of the parts. Maybe we'll do a video tearing it all down. That's going to wrap up this one for me. Thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.